And we begin tonight in the midst of a heat wave, amidst the sweltering heat that is shattering records worldwide. Saudi Arabia announced yesterday that at least 1,300 people have died making the Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina, due to extreme heat. In India, a months-long heat wave has killed more than 100 people since March. And 100 million people in the U.S., nearly a third of the country, spent much of last week under a heat advisory. These temperatures are not normal. They are the direct result of the climate crisis we are currently living in. And scientists are sounding the alarm. Quote, "These heat waves are the fingerprint of climate change," experts said, and are a glimpse of what's to come as human-induced climate change continues to amplify extreme weather. It should be obvious that dangerous climate change is already upon us, a climate scientist told the Washington Post. People will die because of global warming on this very day, unquote. So what does that have to do with politics, political show host, you ask? Well, one of the things exacerbating the climate crisis is fossil fuel extraction that continues to drag every drop of oil and natural gas out of the earth in the quest for unlimited profits. And the U.S. accounts for about 13% of global crude oil extraction. In fact, for all the complaints from Republicans about Joe Biden and his green energy investments, the U.S. is currently extracting more oil and natural gas than ever in this country's history, and the most of any country on earth, including Russia, Nigeria, and Saudi Arabia. And while that is boosting the bottom lines of ExxonMobil and Shell and oil refinery magnates like the Koch brothers, it's not exactly helping the earth not die. And if you think the billionaires behind those companies care about the whole earth dying thing, you would be 100% wrong. On the contrary, America's billionaires, oil, gas, tech, media, and otherwise, are busy tripping over themselves and stampeding over each other to get in front of Donald Trump and hand him millions in campaign donations so he can get back into the White House. And in exchange for the bribes he's soliciting door to door, hat in hand, he's offering to let them operate with less regulation, including drilling on public lands. And that is one of two things you need to understand about the upcoming election. The other is that the massive tax cut Donald Trump signed his first year as president in 2017 was the dream Paul Ryan, the then Speaker of the House, had nursed for most of his adult life. Is set to expire next year on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2025. And while President Biden has vowed to let it expire, Trump is vowing not just to keep those tax cuts, but to add to them, which means the billionaires can gobble up even more tax cuts. That is the reason every other billionaire is kissing Trump's ring. And a lot of non-billionaire rich people, too, including the rappers. It's all about the Benjamins, baby. They don't care about democracy or voting rights or women's rights. In fact, democracy and voting are an inconvenience to the super rich. Because when people get to choose, they almost always choose to tax the rich. Don't believe the BS about people voting against their economic interests. The people who vote for Trump and other Republicans are richer than average, not poorer. And they also don't seem to care that half the time Trump sounds like this.
I have the wounds all over my body. If I took this shirt off, you'd see a beautiful, beautiful person. But you'd see wounds all over me. I've taken a lot of wounds, I can tell you. More than I suspect any president ever. My stupid people, when I wanted to refute it, they said, "Sir, don't dignify it with a rebuttal." Refutal or a rebuttal? What the hell word would that be? Refutal? What they'll say, he didn't know, rebuttal or refutal, but they don't know either. You got to get out and vote. Just this time, I don't care. In 4 years, you don't have to vote, okay? In 4 years, don't vote. I don't care, but we'll have it all straightened out, so it'll be much different. What would happen if this boat is so heavy and started to sink, and you're on the top of the boat? Do you get electrocuted or not? In other words, the boat is going down, and you're on the top. Will the electric currents flow through the water and wipe you out? And let's say there's a shark about 10 yards over there. Would I have to immediately abandon, or could I ride the electric down? And I said, "Sir, nobody's ever asked us that question."
And the other half of the time, he says things like this.
I have an idea for you to make a lot of money. you're going to go and start a new migrant fight league. Migrants, only migrants. And then at the end of the year, the champion migrant is going to fight your champion. And I hate to tell you, Dana, I think the migrant might win. That's how tough they are.
And no matter how cruel or deranged or clearly not cognitively okay this man may be, the billionaires are still willing to drop America into his tiny little hands, just as long as they get to keep that tax cut and get more deregulation. And this Thursday, we're supposed to take that guy that you just heard seriously when he gets on that debate stage with the actual president, the current one, and spews even more. Now, and even more nonsense. Joining me now is NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard. Vaughn, you have been to a lot of these Trump events. You have talked to a lot of these supporters. When they hear Donald Trump talking like we just heard, and we saw the ones in the audience there laughing, how do they explain why they think that's a president?
I think, Joy, for a lot of folks, that there's a reflection or a connection to somebody who is speaking right off the cuff, somebody who, yes, may have a teleprompter in front of him, but goes off on tangents there. And for them, let's be very clear here. I think Donald Trump is convinced that he has been effective as a political candidate over now almost 10 years because of that, because there is nothing stale about Donald Trump, right? We don't know where this political movement ends, but the leader of it is somebody that is consistently providing new material. There are, thousands, if not millions of folks who routinely watch online his campaign rallies. And this is somebody who they follow on social media because you never know what you're going to get. And that is the difference about Donald Trump and somebody who has shepherded and been able to effectively control the base of this Republican Party in no small part, I think, because of his presentation.
Let me play, this isn't your interviews, this is Shaq Brewster, our friend Shaq Brewster. Yeah. He went to and talked to a set of Trump voters, and let's listen to that.
I've been for him since he came down the escalator in 2015, and he does everything by the books. He follows the Constitution.
He's for the people. I'm getting emotional. I don't know.
You're getting emotional?
Yeah.
Why?
I feel like he actually cares about the country.
Who cares who he had sex with before he was president?
You're talking about his trial in New York.
Yeah, well, yeah. But who cares? You know what? I'm not a man, but I'll tell you something. Men and women cheat. And just because what he says he didn't have sex, I believe him. But I believe everything he says.
That was in Wisconsin, Vaughn. But, if we went and saw one of these rallies in Pennsylvania, would those same people be there? Are these people who follow him from place to place? Because I did notice that in that Michigan group, there was a local reporter who actually talked to people, and none of them were locals. None of them were from Detroit. They seemed to be people who follow Trump like the Grateful Dead. Like, are these fans that go from place to place?
There are absolutely those. I can't tell you the number of them that have been to dozens of these rallies and travel around. But by and large, I would say more than 90% easily of the folks are individuals either from that town or folks that drive anywhere from 2 to 3 hours. And I think that this is the part where, I was at Donald Trump's very first mega rally in the summer of 2015. I've been covering them since, is the fact that, folks are a little bit more disconnected from mainstream news sources than they were, right? They're not reading the New York Times, the Washington Post, or even their local papers. A great number of local papers have gone down over the last decade, have gone out of business. They're not watching CNN. They're not watching MSNBC or even NBC Nightly News, right? And so I think that folks, they are tuning into OAN, Newsmax, Right Side Broadcasting Networks. They have outlets, Steve Bannon's War Room. They have outlets there that deliver them oftentimes a different set of facts here. And so I think that, when you hear somebody, you could suggest that they may be a sympathetic figure to a certain degree, because what they have taken in and consumed over the course of now years is information that is not always aligned with the reality that is actually being played out.
Last very quick question. Do those people believe that they received benefits from the 2017 tax cut?
You know, I think that these are a lot of good questions, Joy, and I think that overarching, I think that a lot of this comes down to the idea that Donald Trump has effectively been able to convince, millions of Americans that he is fighting for them. When you get down to the granular, of course, there are many different responses that you get here, but I think that these are legitimate and serious questions, and ultimately, I think that this is going to be like a stage where, frankly, he has not been challenged. He's only done 2 mainstream news interviews over the last 4 years. You don't see him, right? He didn't go on the Republican debate stage. So I think this is where the debate on Thursday night is going to be unique, because it's going to be 90 minutes of potentially him being challenged on some questions like that you're posing from Joe Biden.
Cheers. Let's bring in Matthew Dowd, former Republican strategist and MSNBC senior political analyst. Let's ask you that same. I mean, this is the reality, Matthew. None of those people got the tax cut. Okay, let's just be clear. The tax cut went 80% to corporations and the super rich. If you were not really, really rich, you did not get a tax cut. You might have gotten a few pennies here and there. If you lived in a blue state, your taxes went up because they took away the SALT deduction, so you can no longer deduct your state taxes. If you own a home, your taxes went up because they took away the ability, they reduced the ability for you to write off your home mortgage interest. So the tax cut literally only helped you if you were really rich. Why do people who are not really rich think he's, quote, for the people?
Well, the same reason why they think that he's a religious person, right? No matter how many, I've had conversations with hundreds of Trump supporters, and I live around them in Texas when I'm there. And there's this suspension of disbelief. It's like they're in a Netflix series about UFOs, right? Or Martians. And like all of us, if we get into it, where our emotions take over, and then we no longer sort of say, well, that can't be true. That can't be true. That can't be true. They suspend all that in the course of this. You could go through any number of things that if you just had a fact set and go to them, that they were presented to them, any rational human being that's not caught up in this emotional cycle would be like, oh yeah, you're right, you're right, you're right. The economy, everything. I mean, every single thing. The fact of the matter is Joe Biden has done more for Donald Trump supporters than Donald Trump ever did for his in their how they live at home, their finances, every single the protection of Medicare, protection of Social Security, all those things. But they're in this suspension of disbelief, which is held up, in my view, it's always been held up by the fact that Donald Trump hates and despises the same people they do. The same people Donald Trump hates and despises they do, whether it's people of color, people that have a sexuality that they don't agree with, disabled people, immigrants. Donald Trump makes fun of those people and hates those people just like they do. And that hate, unfortunately, and I don't say this gladly, that hate suspends their logic in their mind when all other factors point to the fact that they should be supporting Joe Biden. The fact that Donald Trump breeds that hate that they actually tap into keeps them as a supporter of Donald.
That's those that are, and the only thing I'll disagree with you there, it's not a Netflix movie, it's a Tubi movie at this stage. Let's talk about the rich people, because part of the, I hear this all the time when people who say they like Trump, and you say why, and they say, because I had more money under Trump. Not possible, because the economy cratered under Trump and you had less money because the economy shut down. How you had more money, couldn't tell you unless you were really, really rich. Here is a woman who is really, really rich. This is a woman she was an Obama fundraiser. She herself is an immigrant. She came to this country from Vietnam. Her name is Allison Hune. She once lived down the street from Steve Jobs in Silicon Valley, yet she claims that what exasperates her about the current era is violent crime and illicit drug use. Maybe illicit drug use, but we're probably talking about a different kind of drug that's in powder form, not crack form. She also said it's not just law and order that pushed her to the right. She would like to see policies such as lower taxes, ding, 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 that benefit businesses and encourage entrepreneurship. Many people are coming to Trump. It's for his good policies, she continued. Quote, look at his 2016 Jobs Act. Couple red flags when I read that piece of course, the New York Post, which didn't, inquire any further. Barack Obama was president in 2016, not Donald Trump. And the thing that she called the Jobs Act, the only thing you can come close to it is the tax cut. They called it the Tax Something and Jobs Act. They called it the Jobs Act. So rich people like this lady, who's really, really rich, are selling to broke people that, well, she had more money because she got the tax cut. That's all they want, right? The tax cut.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's so unfortunate is you would hope in a democracy that people are voting for the common good, right? And even if a wealthy person may have to pay more in taxes, if it's going to help 5 million other people, they would be for it. Some are doing that. People like Melinda Gates, announced that she's going to support Joe Biden, and she's a billionaire, but she's doing it because of choice and abortion and the other issues, not for herself, but for the millions of other people that would be impacted by Donald Trump and his policies or have been impacted by Donald Trump. What's amazing about this is Donald Trump gets away with acting like he's a populist and against the elite when he has the most elite people. And it's not just people running a major 500 corporation with hundreds of thousands of employees. Those people aren't supporting Donald Trump. It's the hedge fund operators. It's the oil company operators. It's all the people that don't have a large contingency of employers with diverse employment. It is these people that are become wealthy and want to keep their wealth.
GREED. There is no other policy they're talking about, y'all. They don't care about anything else. That tax cut's going to expire, and the corporate one is even lower, and these people pay less taxes than their secretaries, and they want to keep on paying and keep on gropping up and walking up that money. That's all this is about. Matthew Dowd, thank you, my friend. I appreciate you. If these were normal times, Donald Trump's federal classified documents trial would have started last month. At this point, we would be in the heart of a trial that was expected to last about 3 months. But of course, these are anything but normal times. And instead of being in a Florida courtroom arguing over the actual facts of the case, today the special counsel's team and Trump's lawyers were in the second of 3 days of farcical hearings set by Judge Aileen Cannon on Trump's claims that the entire investigation is unconstitutional and should be, surprise, surprise, thrown out. In today's performance, Trump's lawyers went after the funding for special counsel Jack Smith's investigation, claiming that it unconstitutionally violates the appropriations clause of the U.S. Constitution. This comes after Friday's claim that Smith's appointment was invalid without Senate confirmation. And I'll say this again, if by small chance Judge Cannon is listening. These arguments have already been made and rejected by multiple courts dealing with special counsels, including the ones who investigated Richard Nixon during Watergate, Robert Mueller, who investigated Trump's ties to Russia, and even with David Weiss, who is investigating Hunter Biden. The one hearing with valid purpose today was over the special counsel's request to impose a limited gag order on Trump to restrict him from making statements endangering law enforcement agents participating in the case. This request stems from Trump's blatantly false and dangerous claims, suggesting that the FBI agents who searched Mar-a-Lago in 2022 were planning to use deadly force against him. As a helpful reminder, first, the language Trump was referring to is standard language in all searches, even in the one used when the FBI searched President Biden's home. Second, Trump's lawyers were informed that the FBI was coming. And third, the FBI conducted the search purposefully on a day Trump wasn't even there. Joining me now is Neil Katyal, former acting Solicitor General and MSNBC legal analyst. Neil, my friend, please tell us, how unusual was it for this hearing to take place, and what new could have possibly been learned on today?
Well, Joy, I really like the way you started by saying if these were normal times, because this hearing today and these hearings before Judge Cannon are anything but normal. She's been entertaining days of arguments about whether the special counsel is unconstitutional, which is pretty much a laughable argument. I had the privilege of drafting those special counsel regulations back in 1999, a long time ago. And I can tell you that we went and presented them to the House and Senate leadership, including the Republicans, including the top Republican lawyers for the House and Senate. Everyone thought they were constitutional. Nobody thought there was any possible problem. And indeed, as you said, this question's been repeatedly litigated, repeatedly lost. This is an enormous waste of time. And I'd say these are specious arguments, but I think actually that's too generous. There's no plausible interpretation of the regulations or the precedent and tradition that surrounds them that would justify the way Judge Cannon has entertained these arguments so far.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.